In today's episode of Plants of the Gods, join ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin in conversation with Dr. Shauheen Etminan as we learn about the fascinating history of mind-altering substances in Zoroastrianism, from ancient medicine to modern mental well-being. We'll learn about the intersection of Iranian culture, Zoroastrianism, the ancient world, and ethnobotany.
I want to welcome everybody to Plants of the Gods. I want to welcome especially our special guest, Shauheen Etminan, a Persian scholar, although he has roots in many places, and he has a fascinating story to tell. I first met him at ESPD 55, which was a celebration, the 55th year anniversary of a conference first put on by Richard Schultes and Albert Hofmann. And I think that his presentation was one of the high points of the conference. Much of the conference focused on the usual suspects, psilocybin, ayahuasca, peyote, coca, but he came in with a literally mind-blowing presentation on the roots of Zoroastrianism, ancient Persia, and religion, and how it ties a lot of these things together. So I would like to turn the floor over to him, and I would like him to introduce many of our listeners who are not very well versed in international history, a bit of background, personal background, and that of Zoroastrianism in the ancient world and in the world today. So welcome, Shauheen, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Plotkin, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on Plants of the Gods podcast. And hello to your audience. My name is Shauheen Etminan. I was born in Iran, kind of like spent half of my life in Tehran and then moved to the West. So I kind of am in at the age of 42, that half of my life been spent on that side of the world and the other half on the other side. But I've always kept my connection to social development and progression and what's currently happening in Iran and in general in that region. A little bit about our work. My background is chemical engineering. I have a PhD in chemical engineering. And the way that I was introduced to plant extraction and plant pharmacology was through the technology of extraction and through basically getting into mass transfer, which was my area of my thesis back in the day, and then basically getting to alkaloids that had different properties, purifying and extracting them from different source of plants, and then from there the whole journey to psychoactives and the pharmacology of these plants was something that I've been working on the past 5 years with VCENNA. I think in 2020, when COVID, I started the extraction on cannabis when the cannabis industry picked up a little bit in 2018. And that was very dedicated on building technology for extraction of basically a cannabis oil in different formats, and different flavonoids, terpenoids, and kind of like all the details about cannabis. And then with the psychedelic renaissance, and living in Vancouver, being very exposed to a kind of like psychedelic mushrooms here, which is pretty lenient. That was when the journey started to do some exploration on psychoactive alkaloids. And that was the path to kind of like getting into chemistry, pharmacology, and then basically I started to look into my own roots, from Iran, and seeing if I'm sure it was basically just there could have been something, and that was where I basically started to do some more study on the anthropology and ethnopharmacology that brought me into introduction to your work, to Richard Schultes' work, to Dennis McKenna, Terence McKenna's, and kind of like the journey of the past 3 years until today.
When my mentor Schultes went off to the Amazon in 1941 and came back with ayahuasca, everybody thought it was this weird, obscure Amazonian liana used by a few isolated tribes. But I think that your work, which builds on some earlier work by other scholars, builds on the idea that perhaps these alkaloids that Schultes found in ayahuasca and chacruna weren't quite unique to Amazonas. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that point for us, please.
Absolutely. Yes, I was actually reading about how some of these compounds and their fascination came to West, with ethnobotanists like him, and even like some at earlier time. But in general, kind of like bringing the knowledge of some of these pharmacologies, especially from admixtures, which is kind of like a little bit of a more complexity. I think that has shed some, I guess, ambiguity for Westerners and the Spanish scientists and scholars to understand the nature and the phenomenology and the subjective experience of some of these compounds. When it comes to ayahuasca, most of your audience and educated psychonauts, they know it as a potent source of tryptamine-based DMT that is being potentiated with a source of beta carbolines that they know it as an MAOI or monoamine oxidase inhibitor that makes the DMT orally active, and then kind of like it inhibits its metabolization or quick metabolization. But when you look into especially even the work of Schultes and some of the ancient tribes from Amazon, the ayahuasca wine, and even my own experience from going to Amazon this past April was the fact that the bark of the tree is kind of like it has a big impact even when you are making ayahuasca versus the chacruna leaves. So I think shedding some lights on how the effect of beta carbolines could be versus DMT was the way that I started just to kind of like dig my curiosity, and then from there that was connected to the story of using Homa Soma on kind of like the West Eurasia, or like where Iran and like east of China was at that time. Plus also recently the paper, I'm not sure if you have seen it, Dr. Plotkin, or not, there was recently a paper about basically unlocking the pharmacology of a remain of basically just what has been left from a Ptolemaic Egypt, that they also found a source of beta carbolines. But the beta carbon on that side of the world doesn't come from the twisted bark of Banistrepsis caapi or yahe. It comes from the brown seeds of Syrian rue, or we call it in Farsi, we call it spand, or they're also known as harmel in the kind of like mostly on the maybe Mediterranean or Northeast Africa. And so I think when I dig into the denominator of where there is a connection between beta carbolines, like independent of where the source is, and again the phenomenology, the subjective experience of those people, there's always you see a connection between mystical experiences or creating mystical realms, or under basically just like the supervision of a shaman or a priest, and these compounds. And I think this is consistent with the stories about the effect of Homa in Avesta, and like kind of what comes from this recent discovery from Egypt, as well as what we know a lot from the shamanic practices in Amazon.
Well, when Schultes did his work and brought these hallucinogens to the fore, the few people in the Western world who were paying attention thought of hallucinogenic plants and fungi as something essentially peculiar to Native American societies. You had peyote on the U.S.-Mexico border. You had the mushrooms in southern Mexico. You had ayahuasca in the northwest Amazon. And then lo and behold, Benny Shannon, the Israeli ethnobotanist, found these alkaloids, some of these same alkaloids in the Sinai. This is from Syrian rue. Then, in listening to a presentation at ESPD 50 5 years before, there was an Australian ethnobotanist who talked about some of these compounds in acacia. Well, the Ark of the Covenant was built from acacia wood. So here's Benny Shannon finding Syrian rue and acacia in the Middle East, and here you are moving not so far from there and finding similar compounds in ancient Persia. Yeah. So talk to my listeners, if you would, about what's the difference between harmine and telepathine, because when the French chemists looked at some of these plants in the late 1900s, mid-1900s, they said, oh, a completely new alkaloid, which is we're calling telepathine.
Absolutely. Yes, I think the primary compound from both Syrian rue and Banisteropsis copy, the bark of Yahe, is harmine. Harmine, it's interesting. We call them like out of like harmala compounds, which is related to Pegonum harmala. But on that side of the world, they call it banistrine, which comes from Banisteropsis copy. But both of them, they are also like the harmine, which is the same compound. Harmine, banistrine, and telepathine are kind of the same name for the same molecule. And this is a fascinating molecule with so many properties, both physiological, neurophysiological, as well as neuropsychological. And this is basically from Pegonum harmala, this is the primary compound. And then the second compound is harmaline, which again, the effect of harmaline is also been studied with our like Chilean psychotherapist Claudio Naranjo, when he also injected back in the day basically the intravenous tetra, I think it was I guess 10-methoxyharmaline into his patients, basically, and the effect that he reported out of those clinical trials, that was fascinating as part of his work. But back into the effect of beta carbolines in general, and our study from the clinical work that we have done, it seems that these compounds, harmine, harmaline, and in case of Banisteropsis copy, which is more rich in tetrahydroharmine, which is another analog of the harmala compounds. So harmine seems to create an effect that is somehow a relation between kind of like the part of hippocampus that creates memory and episodic memory, plus the kind of like a connection to something that is outside. So that's why it's called telepathine, because when you take, and this has been what I have been experiencing because we do like the pure compound, different dosages, there is no imagery like DMT effect, but there is vivid images of, let's say, scenes or places that you have never been to. And this is mostly the effect of harmine, and the effect of harmaline that I presented last year in ESPD also is very fascinating. I recommend your audience to also look into the Healing Journey, the book of Claudio Naranjo. There's a chapter called Harmaline and Collective Unconscious, which when you see that like these patients get very quick epiphanies, like in 5 minutes after the injections, like about something very fundamental in their life. And it seems that the effect of harmaline mostly is a hypnotic or hypnagogic state, that in that state, our mind can, it's exactly like you fall before sleep, or you have fallen asleep, but you're still awake. It's kind of like a lucid dreaming, that our consciousness can go beyond what normally we have access to. And that is the source of a lot of epiphanies or breakthroughs that we have about our collective self, like something that is beyond our conscious mind, that is coming, from basically a vision that you can have from outside. And I think these modalities in general, because they are kind of like very complex in terms of realizations, these they kind of like kept within some type of mystical offering. There was always a priest or a shaman who was more familiar with the modalities beyond our kind of like our normal consciousness, to be able to guide you through that. Because when you step kind of like beyond that line, there is just this whole world of unknown, and could be just anything. There are entities, there are anything that we have no information about, that it needs some skill, that the skill comes from that sage or shaman or priest or like mogus or magi that has been coming, you know, like during the past 5,000 to 3,000 years ago until today.
Well, there's one aspect of this whole flourishing of interest in mind-altering substances, entheogens, is that people don't just think of these things as native to Mexico and Brazil, as would have been the case a couple of years ago. I gave the example of Benny Shannon and the possible impact on the Jewish religion. I had on the pod Brian Morescu, who talked about ergot and Eleusinian mysteries, so it was the basis of ancient Greek religion and quite possibly, and I found it quite convincing, early Christianity. Mm-hmm. But there are two mind-altering substances in Iran or in Persia that I think people need to be thinking of. One of those is hauma, and the other was centered in Shiraz, and that's wine. People don't associate Iran with wine, but when I've tried to expand the scope of plants of the gods with the concept of ideogens, if a hallucinogen makes you hallucinate, and if an entheogen makes you experience the God within, what about creativity? And creativity can be fostered by coffee. It can be fostered by ayahuasca. It can be fostered by wine. You know, there was a Greek philosopher, no, Roman philosopher, who wrote, "No poem was ever written by a drinker of water." So it's my hope, and I think it's shared by many people, that Iran or Persia will reach a stage where hauma and wine can flourish once again, like in the good old days.
Yes, before I go to homo, because that's a very complex topic, I think I want to talk a little bit about the contemporary Iran, because you know, what's been projected from outside is very complex for people to discern and understand. But if you, I guess if you want to understand Iran, you have to look into how many religions and mystical practices kind of were originated and came from Iran. So there has been always a connection between some level of kind of like looking for a higher, you know, understanding from that region of the higher self, or something ancestrally rooted, you know, like within that land. And it's not today's borders of Iran. I would just relate it to the whole Iranian plateau. I think the world, I never use the word Middle East, because that's a kind of like an appropriation of like those borders. But in general, I guess if you want to understand, let's say, look into, like, Islam has come into a land that was populated by another religion, Zoroastrianism, for many years. And then even before Zoroastrianism, there have been, you know, the Indo-Iranians, you know, before coming to that land and going to India, they were the same people, and they had their own religions, and those religions, they were more kind of like shamanic nature. So again, before I go to home, I want to just like go around Shiraz. I'm sure that like people have heard about the wine from Shiraz, but Shiraz is a city in kind of like in the central Iran, that these people are very well known about living always a joyful life. Like they are, some people, they're just making joke about it, that they are also lazy because they always have fun. And I think that's kind of like related to always just being in joy. And Sadi, like the Iranian famous poet, is from Shiraz. Hafez is from Shiraz. So when you go to Shiraz, like you forget about this whole Islamic Republic current narrative of what is, you know, this today's imposed Islamic version is. Like when you're in Shiraz, you are within joy. And even today, you know, like there's no projection on that. So I really hope that like that it can be open, Iran can be open to everybody to go visit, and realize that these are like kind of like a very low quality lies that's been projected for many years. And I guess it's on us, Iranians and the international community, to work together to bring everybody to see the beauties of those lands. But back to Homa. So Homa and Soma are the same word. It's the pronunciation is only different. It's exactly like Hindu, Sindhu, that they're the same word. So Indo-Iranians, before they just kind of moved down to today's land of Gujarat, which is on the northwest of India, Indus Valley, and then come to like kind of like the northeast of Iran, where the Khorasan or today's Afghanistan is, and then again move a little bit to the north, to the southwest, where the Fars is, Fars province is. So they were the same people. They had basically, there are reports that they were participating in shamanic practices, and then kind of like about 2,000 years before Christ, they kind of like separated, they moved, and they kind of settled in different lands. And then Hindus came out, with the whole their own practices, their own gods, their own deities. And then basically the Rig Veda is a transcribed version of their practices, that they have different gods. And then somewhere in this line, Zoroastrianism was created, by this protagonist, priest, philosopher, Zarathustra, who actually was also educated. He was a priest that was like very well educated about the Hindu gods and devas or devs, which are the demons. And then he comes with a new philosophy. I think this is the fascination that I really get about Zoroastrianism, is that it seems that like Zoroastrianism is it's a shamanic practice that, unlike Amazon, that stayed to be shamanic and until today. So they created a shamanic practice. They created a philosophy upon a shamanic practice. And then later on, that philosophy became a religion, which is today's religion. And religions always become institutional. They lose their connection to the direct experience of God or direct experience of the higher realms. And they become something that keep, the mass within a structure of thoughts and morality. So if you dig into Zoroastrianism of today, there is no relation between there is a disconnection. It's exactly like the disconnection between the mystical side of many religions to how the religion was created, how they like the Sufis and the path of being on a spiritual path versus the narrative of Islam in so many areas. So I think from there, what happened was that if you look into the Rig Veda, there are narratives about Soma, and then Soma in Rig Veda is a deity, is a god, and it's also a drink, the drink of immortality that has been referred kind of like very metaphorically in different settings, and the understanding of that has made it very difficult. So on the other side, there have been scholars like David Flattery and Martin Schwartz that about 40 years ago, they actually wrote a book, Homa and Harmaline, that one distinction that they brought was that because there were a lot of ambiguity about the understanding of Soma in that entheon, in Rig Veda, so they separated Homa and Soma. And they brought the understanding of Homa within the text of Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrians, and actually brought a linguist who is Martin Schwartz, who is the kind of the only known scholar who understands Gotha better than anybody else. And Gotha is the Old Testament, but it's basically just the direct poems of Zarathustra. And then the Avesta is is not directly related to the prophet Zarathustra. There are kind of like the rest of the texts that were put together by the other magi or by the other priests later on. So one distinction here is that basically the Gotha or the Avesta or basically what was transcribed on the Zarathustra, basically the Zoroastrian part, like it happened about 1,000 years later than Rig Veda. And that 1,000 year that this kind of like these poems and hymns was written is counted as kind of bringing more accuracy into like what we can understand about the subjective effect and maybe about the botanical identity of Homo. So when you look into to Gotha, like the Gotha is very limited, is very known what it says. There is no direct referral to Homo. There is a direct referral to Darusha, which is basically burning of the active compounds of Homo. So there is a relation to burning of a substance that is psychoactive, but it's called Darusha. Basically, that's the way of consuming it. And then there's another referral that is basically there's been translated as this filthy intoxicant. And that is being translated by many of Zoroastrianism as the disapproval of use of Homo by Zarathustra, because, and the reason for that is they were saying that like there were a lot of like too much shamanic practices, and then there were enslaving of animals, for those shamanic practices that at some point basically Zarathustra come, and then there's a third actually relation that I think this is kind of related to today's use of psychedelics as well, that like these are technologies that can be held by good people and can be held by wicked priests, and then the disapproval is actually related to this Homo cult that Zarathustra is kind of trying to stay away from, because there are the priests that are counted as wicked priests, that they are not guiding people to the right direction, but to the other direction. So these are all very subjective, but like a little bit deeper into, again, the pharmacology or the botanical identity. So it comes from a plant. There's a referral to something yellow. There are twigs of that plant. And so the yellow, it doesn't matter. It doesn't say if it's a plant or what it is, but the direct translation of Homo or Soma means to press out. So this is a good understanding about Homo Soma, is that Homo Soma was not a plant. Like there are a lot of people looking for the botanical identity of it, which is fine, but botanical identity doesn't mean that it was a plant. It was an extract. So it was an extract that the priests or magi, they were pressing them in pestle and mortar in a very specific ritual. And then it was only taken by priests. It was created by priests and served to the priest. And then there are referrals and stories about other people. Let's say there is for example, a story about a king called Wishtas, which was the patron or the king during the Zarathustra, which is the time is not clear. Some people they're saying that it's about, let's say, 1700 before Christ. Some people they're saying it's like 600 before Christ, and some even like 6,000 years before Christ. So the time of the Zarathustra is not clear. But 1700, based on what I've talked to Martin Schwartz, is the closest one with BC, 1700 BC. And so basically this potion, which was extracted, was given to him. And then there are always a relation between taking this potion and then this out of body journey of multiple days. Let's say, for example, in the case of Wishtas is about 3 days out of body experience, and then he comes back and then he kind of follows the teachings of Zarathustra. So this is directly about that. And then, for example, there's another story which is very well documented. There's a book about it. It's the book of Ardaviraz that I also presented in ESPD 55. So this is a book that your audience can search it. It's called the Letter of Ardaviraz, or the Book of Ardaviraz. This is an independent 8,000 words, kind of like, I call it the first trip report in the history, that is all about basically a righteous man that was selected by the Magi in a very specific time of Iran, which I call it like the today's time, that there's a lot of hopelessness about kind of like the situation, like of in that time, I think it was about the religion, because the religion was a primary part of everyone's life. And then the priest, they choose a righteous man in a fire temple in today's Fars. It's called the Farambag Fire Temple. Its ruins is still left. I just recently learned about it. And this was the fire temple of the priests. And And then he was invited, he's selected among, let's say 10 people. And then, let's say through a very thorough process, the whole book like takes you through this process. And then he again, like they take a poll, again, he's selected for the second time. And then he's chosen to be sent by taking this intoxicants, directly talking about, let's say, the 3 cups of this intoxicant that he drinks. And then he goes through a preparation. It sets intention. He talks about, let's say, the people that he loved and he had lost, and then through a kind of like a ritual of 7 days that they were chanting hymns of Avesta. He has this 7 days out of body journey, and then he comes back, and then the rest of the story is about what he saw in the life after death. So these are the 2, and then basically the revelation of Zarathustra is also relevant to taking Homa. That's kind of that is also part of Avesta. So if your audience wants to look into Avesta, basically each different part of Avesta is called yasnas. So the yasna 9, 10, and 11 takes you through the story of Homa, what Homa was. They're chanting invocation about Homa. They're calling Homa. It's about making Homa. It mentions that Homa brings you prosperity. It brings you wellness. It brings you immortality. Homa, it means it brings basically just like it. Homa differentiates and discerns between good and bad, which is kind of this dichotomy of the kind of like within the philosophy of Zoroastrianism, about like the fact that we are exposed to both and we have the will to choose. And also it's interesting because there is also a direct mention in Yasna 10 that Homa also came in many kinds, which is exactly like ayahuasca, that we have different type of Banister's coffee, yahe, that's been used in different formats of this admixture psychoactive brew. So as you see, Zoroastrian priests, even though it was kept within their caste, they knew what they were concocting for different settings. And it was not only Homa. For example, in these 2 stories that I mentioned, the potion is called Mang, which seems that it's a combination of Homa and atropine alkaloids. That's kind of basically, they call it Mang because it was combined with henbane and Hyoscyamus, Niger alkaloids. That is kind of like, if we, based on research, if we believe that, and I can't dig into that Homa's main compounds was this hypnotic, oneirophonic, dream-inducing compounds, the beta-carbolin compounds, it's kind of like the Mang of which thus this potion was even a little bit more complex, that they were also adding scopolamine, atropine, or, let's say, and these compounds to even like make it, basically it's a different channel, it's a different receptor profile to be, to kind of like to bind, and then subjective experience that was being called.
Okay, very good. Well, look, this is lots to chew on here, and I want to get some of this information from you that I can put in the show notes so people will know where to go for more information. I know we're not supposed to post our ESPD 55 papers yet, but some of the other stuff that you shared with me I think would be very relevant and very interesting to our listeners. So I want to thank you, Shauheen, but I want to throw out a challenge so we can pick up the conversation next time.
Absolutely.
And that is this. In all this research and thinking and studying and ceremonies about this whole psychedelic renaissance, every time I hear about mystical experiences, particularly with regard to religion and the sacred and worship, I think, is there a plant behind this? Is there a fungi behind this? And as I mentioned, this Israeli ethnobotanist has found these ayahuasca alkaloids in the Sinai. Carl Ruck, Morescu, even Wasson are responsible for us rethinking some of the origins, not only of ancient Greek religion, but ancient Christianity. There are other religious mysteries and visions which may be attributed to this, like Muhammad's ascent to heaven. I'm no expert on Islam, but, like I said, we need to look at all these things through the prism of alkaloids in plants. And I do this not as an insult to people who don't accept this, just as a thought proposition. So my thought proposition for you, Shauheen, is where these religions connect, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, is the gift of the Magi. Yeah. And we think the gift of the Magi is gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, in Monty Python's Life of Brian, which I think is a brilliant movie, when they give the stuff to Brian's mother, she says, next time, just bring more gold. But my challenge to you, and that which I want to discuss next time, is do you think perhaps the gift of the Magi might have been Hauma as well? Don't answer. Think about it. Let's talk next time.
Absolutely.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to check out other episodes, from ayahuasca to magic mushrooms, from the ethnobotany of warfare to the history and prehistory of wine. Please give us a top rating and subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our next episode, we'll hear Dr. Plotkin in conversation with Dr. Gary Nabhan as they walk through the history of ceremonial uses of agaves in traditional cultures and fermented beverages in Mexico.